It seems extraordinary that there's nothing that the coronavirus doesn't touch.
All seen Black Lives Matter demonstrations.
Oppression is brought out.
So unfortunately, because I just feel like we're going down this road, we've been down this road before. Things like we've had.
Hello and welcome to Your Voice. My name is Gabriel Rena, and tonight we're talking about the story we've been waiting to report since Your Voice, since inception back in June 2020. I'm talking, of course, about the George Floyd murder case in Minneapolis, which on Tuesday saw the 12-person jury return with a guilty verdict against former police officer Derek Chauvin. It's a story which the world has followed with interest for nearly a year, culminating in a 3-week trial, with the jury needing less than a day to return their verdict of guilty on 3 charges: second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and manslaughter. We'll be unpacking this historical trial and the wider topic of policing in the black community in the United States over the next hour. And joining me in the studio to help do this are journalist and commentator Richard Sudan, media entrepreneur and public analyst Rotimi Pedro. Thank you all for joining. So let's go straight to you, Richard. With so many black people having died in the hands of police, why is George Floyd's case so different?
I think what it was about the George Floyd case was, of course, it was captured on film, as a lot of these instances are, but it was very quickly shared around the world. And what it did was spark a kind of collectivized sense of trauma in black communities around the world, and with all right-minded people around the world too. And so, you know, it sparked this kind of a wave of fury that we saw translate into kind of global protests. Of course, the Black Lives Matter protests began really in 2015, right, after the death of Mike Brown in Ferguson. But I think it was also the nature of the killing itself, which we can now call it a killing. Derek Chauvin, you know, kneeled on the neck of George Floyd for nearly 9 minutes. He stared brazenly and defiantly into the camera. Many would say comfortable, secure in the knowledge that he was never going to face the sort of accountability that he's now had to face. Right. And I think also it kind of flies in the face really of the image that the United States often likes to put around the world of being a sort of fair, free democracy. Yes. And a lot of people really at that point were kind of side-eyeing America and saying, what's going on? You're not even, look at how you're treating your own black citizens who built the country.
That's a very good point. Richard mentioned about one of the things that kind of spiraled and had a ripple effect about that particular case was the fact that there was a camera there, a phone camera. Do you think, Rotimi, that the pandemic played a key role because it happened during the height of the first pandemic? Do you think that also played a key role?
Well, I mean, if I could say there's any silver lining in this, I mean, it's probably the fact that the pandemic helped the world to really focus on what's going on. And the fact that it's a fusion of technology and the pandemic together, and a lot of people sitting at home doing nothing and being able to connect to what's going on as a reflection of what we thought America was and what it actually is. Yes. In a way. And in a way, I mean, it actually focuses, it's a global awakening moment for social justice and everything accumulated into that pandemic period. We are all at home trying to figure out what to do with our lives.
Right, thank you. So earlier today, I had the pleasure of speaking to Raspek Rebellion to ask for his take on the situation in the United States in 2021. This is what he had to say.
What the world can learn from the George Floyd case is that the institutional racism within America at large is still rife. We saw, every single one of us saw a video of a man being murdered with officer's leg on his neck. Now, this is worse than a civilian doing this because these police are paid. They are paid. This is why a lot of people are saying, you know, when the police officers are mixing up their guns for their tasers, or they're shooting young girls because they're saying they've got weapons on them. You are paid and you are trained to be able to peacefully take down an individual. For me, it's not a time to celebrate. The sentencing hasn't happened yet, so we don't know what's going to happen. He took someone's life deliberately, as the camera showed. Yeah, he deliberately took someone's life. So, and in America, they have the death penalty for those sort of things. You know what I'm saying? So for me, that could be the only message that would actually go out, and police officers would watch that and say, I ain't gonna do that no more. But if it ain't that, then the people, because they spent £1 million on George Floyd's coffin. This is when you know us as a people, half of it is them, half of it is us, my brother. Half of it is our mentality. We was on the Black Lives Matter big wave, yeah? And then when the hype dies down, yeah? When the hype dies down, the people that done Blackout Tuesday, we can't see them again, yeah? So people like to move with the hype, my brother. You know what I'm saying? But I'm saying this is a consistent battle that many of us have been fighting before George Floyd, and we will continue to fight after George Floyd.
So I'm just going to take a few comments from you, Richard, and from you, Rotimi, about that piece there. What's your take on what Raspek had to say?
I think he makes a lot of valid points, and I think one of the takeaways from it for me was the same energy, the same focus that the world and activists and the lawyers for George Floyd, etc., the same energy on that case now needs to translate into all the other cases. And let's be clear, during the trial process of George Floyd, around 60 or so people also died brutally at the hands of the police. That's during the trial process. And so this is one case amid many cases. Like Raspek said, it's all very well and good protesting, but that energy, focus and commitment has to be translated moving forward, because unfortunately, the system in America is such that unless there are serious systemic changes, there's nothing really to incentivize the police at the moment to really stop them doing more killings like this in the future. I mean, this is one case, but unless it sets a precedent moving forward, and unless, as Raspek rightly says, Chauvin hasn't yet been sentenced. So in my view, unless Chauvin gets anything less than the rest of his natural life behind bars, that's going to be an injustice to the Floyd family. And also, this is a stepping stone in the path towards justice for me. This isn't necessarily justice yet.
Right. So, Rotimi, is this justice or is this accountability?
I think we should focus more on the accountability part of it. I mean, and I think that's what that can actually what can create reforms, because it's just one case. It's just one. I mean, you can look from a legal angle. What has this achieved? It's only set a precedent where these facts are exactly the same in the future. Then you would get this. But once the facts go outside that framework of this case, the legal significance is lost on us. So the legislation needs to come into place. The reforms in the American George Floyd Act needs to go through Congress and actually create an institutional framework where we can actually see some meaningful change.
Well, with that, do you foresee that happening? Would this be the start of the change that America needs in policing reform?
I hope so, but I'm very skeptical now. On the one hand, it seems very positive, the Justice in George Floyd Policing Act. But if it becomes law, if you peel apart the layers of it and you look at the small print, it actually gives the police almost $1 billion nationwide to the police forces. Now, on the one hand, it might sound good that we are trying to force and incentivize the police, for example, to turn on their body cameras, but they're already supposed to turn on their body cameras with things, for example, in the Act, like the controversial chokehold. This, in some states, is already supposed to be illegal. So the question really for me is, what mechanisms are going to be put in place to make sure the police follow any laws that become new, because they're already supposed to follow the laws that already exist. And actually, even within the currently existing laws and the Constitution, already the police are not supposed to kill people in the manner they're killing them. So really, I'm saying, what's going to be the difference in this new bill if it becomes law? What's going to make the police follow these laws, that law, and the existing laws already?
So I think one of the things that they were also agreeing on is having like what you call a bad apples database, where you have a database of all these police who have like complaints against them, so that at least you know if the pattern is beginning to emerge and you can step in, you know. So because I feel like the reform has already started in the courts. Is that the best place to start? Because with this conviction, which is quite a few, you've never heard of a conviction of a police officer on duty before. So the reform is beginning to start in the courts. Is that the best place to start it? Because they should have started the reform a long time ago. But then it's taken the law to kind of step in for them now to kind of look at now, look, okay, we need to revisit?
I think it's just symbolic. I mean, it's just going to say, okay, now someone has been punished. I think without statutory law, in terms of passing the act itself, there can be, it's only when the facts fits into the George Floyd, someone is kneeling on the neck again, or similar circumstance, that you can actually say, well, there was a precedent prior to this that would make the same thing happen, another conviction happen. But without that, and you have a similar, like the girl that was just shot, or the boy, the 13-year-old boy that was killed a couple of weeks ago, the facts are not the same, so you might not get the same outcome. Right. Compared to what happened here. And that's the reason why things like body cams, things like the database, where a police officer cannot go from one state to another after having a bad record in one state and going on to another and just getting enrolled and doing the same thing all over again. So it's important that that institutional framework. Plus, let's not forget that policing itself is based on profiling, one way or the other. And there's institutional cultural issues around that. Why do black men always get targeted? What's the history behind? What's the policing culture around that? And how do we make sure we correct the background information in their head and why they're so scared of the black community?
Right, thank you so much. There's a lot to talk about. We're going to take a short break now, but please join us again for part 2, when we'll be taking a closer look at the use of deadly force by the US police. See you in a few minutes. Welcome back to today's Your Voice, where we're reacting to the developments in the George Floyd case and looking at the wider issues surrounding policing in the black community in the United States. For the last 5 years, there's been an average of 1,000 people per year shot dead by the police in America. Yet, if you break that down to race, you'll find that you're 2.5 times more likely to be one of these statistics if you're of African American ethnicity. Before we get back into the main discussion, I want to share with you a part of a conversation I had earlier with North Carolina-based Michaela Kosia. Here's part 1 of her take on policing of the black community in the United States.
I still feel like they're still in the mindset that we are animalistic, we are dangerous, we are a threat by just existing, by literally just breathing. Anything we do needs to be policed. And unfortunately, there's a system in place to keep these things going. And that's where the police brutality comes, the over-policing of black neighborhoods, the over-policing of black bodies. And now with social media and all that, you have the black trauma porn, people posting videos of black men being shot, black girls being shot. And I think police, they know how to handle people in situations when it comes to de-escalation and when it comes to proper policing. They know how to do it because I've seen it done. I've seen video. Actually, most recently, I can give you an example. Most recently, there was a white man who, I saw a video, somebody was recording it. He was in a car and he had a hammer. He actually hit one of the police officers in the head with a hammer. It's not funny, but I think it's just like, y'all know how to react. So he hit a police officer in the head and then he sped away in his vehicle with the police officer holding on to the side of the car. This man was apprehended alive. He was not killed. He was not shot at. So they knew how to preserve his life. Unfortunately, that's not how black men are treated. Black men are treated as animals. They're treated as, like I said, dangerous. And that goes back to the old racial stereotypes about, the animalistic ways from slavery. Black people were treated like herds of animals. So I still think, yes, we have the civil rights movement and we've had some progress, but it goes to the old saying of, I'm not exactly, don't quote me, but it's like a lot has changed, but a lot has not changed in a very large amount of time. But At the same time, you also have to understand that the civil rights movement was only like 50 some years ago.
Right. So Rotimi before the break mentioned that, you know, a lot of policing has got to do with profiling. And, you know, Michaela also mentioned something about, you know, black profile. Why is that such an issue? Is it because, you know, police feel like we have a bit more, you know, as black people, we're kind of a bit more stronger, or why can't they de-escalate rather than use the excessive force?
For me, this really goes, we have to look way, way back, right to the beginning of the history of the police. Now, the police in the United States were initially formed as slave-catching gangs to catch black people who were property a couple of hundred years ago. And unfortunately, culturally, that legacy has filtered through, and we see that same mindset in not all, but many of the police officers who are operating today. Of course, the police is infiltrated by many white supremacists from white supremacist groups, including the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. This was acknowledged by the FBI Director Christopher Wray in March of this year. And actually, you know, to be clear, in 2015, there was a really comprehensive study done. And in 2015, it was proven that actually more black people died in 2015 at the hands of the state, at the hands of the police, than during one of the worst years of the Jim Crow era. Wow. So, of course, there have been some strides made, undoubtedly. But at the same time, a lot of people are saying what's really changed. If you've got children that can just be killed at the hands of the police, if you've got people that can just be unarmed, Breonna Taylor killed in her sleep, what's really changed? You know, you've got a situation in the US where many people, like in the case of Daniel Prude, for example, in 2020, he was having a mental health crisis. His brother called the police in New York to help bring his brother in to take him to hospital, and the police actually ended up pushing Daniel Prude face down in the streets. Daniel Prude was half naked, begging for his life, and he subsequently died. And there are so many cases like this. So a lot of people are saying, what has changed?
Nothing. It seems as if, you know, the issues of policing is not just exclusive to America. We have the issues here. We also even have it as far back as Africa. In Nigeria. Yeah. Talk to us about that.
Well, I think one of the legacies of George Floyd would be the fact of the global awakening. In mixed societies, it almost re-engages the discussion around slave history, statues, and things like that. Do we pull them down? In not so mixed, in terms of maybe tribally diverse as we have in Africa, we had a situation where the effect of George Floyd was almost like let's talk about this police brutality that's been going on in our society for years and years. We're not going to stand for it anymore. And you saw the End SARS movement, and which hopefully has led to some form of reforms back in Nigeria, in my home country. Here, it's maybe, at least we can see the effect of pulling down the statues. I mean, that maybe we knew were quite an affront to our heritage and our history, but this wider society never appreciated that until George Floyd died, and it became a global issue. So in the real sense of it, beyond policing, we engage now in more like racial relations. We also engage in terms of ending brutality elsewhere. I mean, I think in Nigeria, hopefully the compensations are going out to people that have been killed by End SARS over the years. And I mean, the tribunals are still going on. And let's hope that at least there would be something that as a society, globally, black, white, mixed, that we can all take out from this.
Right. So Richard, you know, over here, the Race Equality Act Commission wrote a report recently that actually is quite damning. And I mean, if there's anything that's going to be encouraging more sort of divisive act, it's that report, you know. And why is that report, and how is that affecting our community as a race? Because it's as if, you know, the racial issues were a thing of the past. In today's world, we live in a post-racial era, according to that report, of my interpretation of it at least. What's your take on that?
I mean, to be clear, that report has been thoroughly sort of rebutted by sort of leading experts. First of all, some of the people that were said to be consulted in the research in it were not actually consulted as they were made out to be. I believe the Equality Commissions actually suggested that 10 Downing Street actually kind of altered their original sort of take of it. And a lot of people have really described that report as gaslighting, an attempt to psychologically manipulate people into denying their own lived experiences of racism. And unfortunately, in this country, you see the disparities of racism in housing, employment, in policing, in education, etc., and so on, and the list goes on and on. So, you know, there have been some strides made, but on the one hand, you know, I've covered a couple of cases really, the case of Moy Bashir and also Mahmoud Hassan in Wales. These are two young black men who died following deeply suspicious circumstances and contact with the police. Moy Bashir was having a mental health crisis. Again, like the story I just mentioned, his family actually dialed 999 to get an ambulance, and the police turned up, basically barged their way into the house, exacerbated an existing wound on Moyd's leg, and Moyd bled to death. So just like in the United States, over here we have a situation where all too often black people and non-white people are viewed as targets rather than people that need care, need to be viewed as human beings. Again, we're not saying all police, but at the same time, the kind of bad apples argument is an interesting one, because a lot of people say, well, if it's a bad apples argument, why are the good police officers not standing up and being more vocal about this?
Right. I mean, if you say the bad apples, I mean, if a bad apple falls to, if you're going to a vineyard and you see a bad apples on the floor, you have to check the tree to see what's wrong with this tree. Why is it producing all these bad apples?
Right.
And where you have a situation like in the United States, as I said, we have the Joy Gardner report here. It's not different from what this current report. When the there's institutional racism, I don't think we should expect much from a report that comes out of that. Like in the United States, you have a guy that just committed a mass murder, walking out of the scene, and the police are waving at him, giving him water. He just killed 2 people. And you get a situation where a black guy running away, like Mr. Wright that was killed a couple of days ago, fled in the scene of an arrest, and you shoot him in the back. So how do you justify that sort of disparity in policing in the community? With one hand, you have someone that just committed a mass murder, killed 2 people. You added him water, and you waved at him, come on, running at you with assault weapon, nothing. And in the other situation, somebody's fleeing and you pump bullets into it.
So when are we going to, in the UK, when we're going to start holding the police to account? When can we start doing that, like they're starting in America?
Well, I mean, if you talk to the families of victims of people that have died in police custody and following police contact, they'll tell you the racism is twofold. The racism happens in terms of the person who dies in custody, and then if you talk to families, as they try to pursue justice, as they try to engage in things like the IOPC, the so-called independent body that investigates police alleged misconduct, they'll tell you they experience racism in the sense of they can't get their complaints through the system. The system is rigged at each and every juncture to prevent them getting justice. There's a problem with the coroner's report. There's a problem with judges. It's almost like a kind of revolving conveyor belt of racism for a lot of people. So in regards to when do we see the police get held to account? When they're forced to be held to account. I think a lot of people in this country would say that we want a police service, not a police force.
Right.
Again, you know, my friend the poet Benjamin Zephaniah, his cousin Mikey Powell, another example of a young black man who was having a mental health crisis. The police turned up. You know, they say that Mikey died from asphyxia, but he died because he was basically bundled into a van and run over by the police and basically beaten up and brutalized by them. And there are so many cases like this, and actually you do see a massive disparity in treatment from white communities compared to non-white communities. The police nearly always treat white communities much differently. They're almost trained to view non-white communities in a particular way. Again, we're not saying all of the police, but far too many officers within the police view things and operate in this manner.
Thank you so much. We're going to have to come back to that. So that's the end of part 2. Join us after the break, where we'll be looking further into the roots of issues surrounding policing in the black community. See you in a few minutes. Hello and welcome back to Your Voice. I'm Gabriel Reno, and this week we're discussing not only the George Floyd murder case, but also the wider issue of policing in the black community in the United States. With the numbers of police killings rising, not falling, should we be looking into other options of policing a community altogether? But before we get into the discussion, I want to share with you the next section of Michaela Kossia's answer on policing the black community in the United States?
Okay, so do black people have to take a sense of responsibility for the way we are policed? This is my thing. Black people do take responsibility, okay, in the black communities. The thing is, the organizations that are in the black communities, people are not aware of them. A lot of them do not have the money and funding that, say, like the Black Lives Matter movement, the Black Lives Matter national organization has, because Black Lives Matter has separate organizations within each city, within each city and within each state as well, and sometimes within each county. It depends, and they're started by local activists. And as part of the Black Lives Matter movement, there is a lot of gun violence organizations that are involved that aren't called Black Lives Matter, but they're a lot of nonprofit organizations that are local, but nobody like really seeks out to find that, because it's always easier to blame the victim. It's easier to blame the victim. The BOB, the black on black crime, grinds my gears. It grinds my gears, because that is something that is a white supremacy tool that has been used to pit us against each other, or to pit against the black community. And that's where it's a strategy of victim blaming, because you are expecting people who are oppressed that, it's kind of like the whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps logic. And how can a community pull themselves up by the bootstraps? They ain't got no strap. They don't have boots to pull. So the black on black crime, I also seen a lot of black people say that, unfortunately, because when you first hear it, it's just like, oh yeah, like, why don't we like take accountability? Like, in order to progress, you have to take accountability. And this is even talking about like personally, to be a better person, you have to take accountability for your actions and how you contribute to your oppression, or not oppression, but how you contribute to your flaws. But in the grand scheme of things, when it comes to white supremacy and oppression, it's a systemic thing. No matter how much we do, how much organizing we do, from what I've seen, it's honestly really sad. And it's kind of like an abusive cycle that I see happening on and on and on, generational by generation by generation. And it's hard to change the community when there's a system in place to continually keep you at where you're at.
Please welcome back my studio guests, Richard Sudan, Rotimi Pedro, and joining me from United States East Coast via the internet, social engineer and activist, David Matthew. Thank you for joining, David. So, Michaela mentioned about black on black crime, and it's like a tool for victimization. What's your take on the whole black on black crime?
It's such nonsense, to be honest with you. Like, when white people sort of commit crimes on each other, you never hear white on white crime. A lot of the time the racist sort of media and others will say, well, it's a culture problem in the black community, it's black on black crime. But when black people do something good or achieve something, suddenly blackness is removed from the equation and they regain their ability to be viewed as individuals. So it's just a kind of diversion tactic. In my view, black Americans do not owe any explanation to America. America owes black Americans, specifically the descendants of slaves, they owe black Americans in that context reparations and restorative justice. And you'll notice that actually the conversation about reparations was really popular round about election time in November. Joe Biden and others were all talking about it, and all of a sudden it seems to have magically fallen off the agenda. It's almost like it was just a talking point for electioneering. So for me, the whole black on black crime, in the same way this kind of a buzzword is used here, is false. It's a kind of a way to divert attention away from the systemic and ongoing injustices that black people face.
Right, thank you. Hi, David, and thanks for joining again. Before you joined, we were talking about obviously the verdict of Derek Chauvin, and it's quite key that the cause of death played a very critical part in finding him guilty. Talk to us about that.
Well, yes. I mean, you saw his defense team, trying to deflect away from the obvious and self-evident fact that he died from Derek Chauvin, that George Floyd died of Derek Chauvin's knee on his neck. They tried to bring up carbon monoxide. They tried to bring up the amount of drugs in his system, which were, by the way, flatly rebuked by the experts in the field, by the pulmonary experts and all the other experts that the prosecution brought into the courtroom. So even though, cause of death for some people may be somewhat controversial, it really wasn't when you look at the facts of the case. It was very clear what was the proximate cause of George Floyd's death, and it was Derek Chauvin.
So is it possible for black people to police themselves now in light of all this that's going on?
Absolutely. I think what you have to have in a police force in America is you have to have a police force that has direct affinity for the communities that they are policing. So too often in America, we have police forces who feel that they have an adversarial role with the communities they serve. So you have a police force that is really antagonistic towards the black community. They do not have an affinity for the black community, and thus they find the black community to be their enemy. And let's not forget that the legacy of policing in the United States, particularly in the South, where policing was established to preserve the system of slavery. Until that system is uprooted and we're actually able to take out not just one or two bad apples, but a systemic system that still carries that legacy to this day, we will not see connectivity and proper community engagement with the police officers and the communities they serve. Now, what does that look like? It does look like black communities policing themselves, but it also looks like in a multicultural society, a society that says all of our humans are valued to the point where we have an affinity for every single person we serve across the board. Now we can debate how that's best achieved, but until you really uproot the core evils within the legacy and the history of United States policing, everything else will just be piecemeal.
Right. Thanks, David. So, Rotimi, before you were talking earlier about, policing in the black and white communities and the sort of divide of black people, and how they view police. I remember a time where they had police liaison, and I don't know how effective that was, but my thinking is, if you had a police liaison that was from the community, would that have any sort of positive impact in policing in that community?
It should. I think even going beyond that, I think we need to look at policing from the 21st century perspective and not just focus on the outcome of crime, crime in the community. We need to look at the historical issues, or economic issues, social issues that leads to the crime, the causes of crime. And this has already sparked a lot of discussion and debate around defunding the police and putting the money in community initiative, education, to actually take people off the street, that as opposed to allowing them the culture of anti-police and anti-crime, crime issues to actually fester before you start policing it. So you try to tackle it from the beginning. So I think socially, social scientists have looked into this and say, okay, how did it get there in the first place? And what's the relation between the communities and the culture of it? And I was saying earlier on, it's about some mutual trust. You look at the situation in the United States, I was trying to use the George Floyd's fright on his face when the gun was drawn on him at that point. So you find out, why are these guys fleeing police scene? Because they might just lose their life. They have 2.5 chance more of interaction with the police of losing their lives than any other group. So that feeds on itself back again, and it creates a lot of division and mistrust between the community. That needs to be rebuilt back again. That, look, we are here for you. We are here to protect you, not to shoot you.
You see, what I find quite amazing, because they talk about, social issues, and they talk about, black people within the social spectrum, but it doesn't matter, because when I look at some of these stories, there was a lieutenant who had his uniform on in a petrol station and who was still being tear gassed by the police. And how can you justify that level of force, Richard, on a person who's actually part of the structure in America?
Well, you obviously can't. I think you're talking about the case of Caron Nazario, who the incident I think actually happened in December of last year in Virginia. And what the video showed actually was the Lieutenant Nazario basically pulling into a gas station with two police officers barking orders at him. But actually, he was actually being followed on this road going much further back. And he had the fortitude of mind to actually continue into a well-lit area precisely because he was already in fear for his life because of the legacy of policing in the United States. And what you saw there was a situation that plays out very differently in many other videos we've seen, unfortunately. So the police were basically shouting these conflicting orders at him, and actually he had the presence of mind to just keep his hands very still on the steering wheel, to not actually follow their orders and move, because he felt they were just looking for any excuse to pull the trigger on him, and he was actually very lucky to get out of the situation alive. The police in that situation did actually then go and pepper spray him in the face and assault him. He's now pressing charges against those officers. But again, you know, this is one of many videos we see of unrestrained police violence, and many would say trigger-happy police are spoiling for a fight. They're looking for any excuse to, bring violence to a situation. And a lot of people say in the United States that many of these police forces that are infiltrated by white supremacist groups, and this is fact, a lot of them go out intentionally looking for a black person to kill. That's just a fact according to many activists and experts in America, if you talk to them.
Wow, interesting stuff. That's the end of part 3. Join us after the break when we'll be wrapping up the discussion in the 4th and final part of Your Voice. See you in a few minutes. Hello and welcome back to Your Voice. We've been discussing the recent guilty verdict reached by the jury in the George Floyd case. In this final part, I want to take a look at what kind of precedents this case sets. President Biden dropped sound bites in his reaction speech saying, systemic racism is a, quote, stain on our nation's soul, unquote. And the killing in Minneapolis last June was a, quote, a murder in full light of day, and it ripped the blinders off the whole world to see, unquote. But for a lot of people, it's another case of talk being cheap. Before we hear my panel's opinions, let's bring back Michaela Kosia one last time for part 3 of our earlier discussion.
I think it's a great, I think it is a great kind of like victory story due to how everything started and where we're at right now. And it gives us a sense of hope for those who were looking for the still little piece of hope that we have in our spirit, like I do. However, at the end of the day, we know that this is not done. We know that this is something that is a continuous work. This is something that we have to always speak up about. This is something we also always have to contribute in our way, because I will say not everybody is going to be out there marching.
Please welcome back one last time Richard Sudan, Rotimi Pedro, and still here with me via the internet is David Matthew. So David, what message does the guilty verdict on Derek Chauvin set for the whole world?
Well, I mean, it certainly sends a message in a high-profile case, but my concern is, you know, had George Floyd's murder not been videotaped, would we even be here? Would Derek Chauvin even have been charged? What about all the victims of police brutality who don't get the high profile that this case got, and their killers are never brought to justice? So, you know, I certainly am pleased that Joe Biden has come out and acknowledged this problem, and also that he has assigned Attorney General Merrick Garland to investigate the Minneapolis police and other police departments to root out systemic racism in policing. But then until we have a sustained systemic solution to this, I don't think we can get too excited about just one case. Even though it is, you know, what I'm happy for is for George Floyd's family that they have some sense of solace that the person who killed George Floyd is brought to justice and there's accountability. But until we have that widespread and until we have a cultural change in policing, I don't think we should get too excited about just one singular case, which unfortunately is still an outlier in our justice system.
Right. Okay. So you were talking, Richard, about defunding the police. What is that? Is that the solution? And what is that solution?
Well, I think in the US, a lot of people think it is the solution. A lot of people see their tax dollars go into an organisation that not only does not really safeguard their interests or look after them, it does the exact opposite. I think people want to see a police force that is held accountable to the same measure of the law that they are. And actually, there are a lot of people that will tell you in the US, Joe Biden's words are simply not good enough. He needs to take some serious action. A lot of people wanted to see some sort of executive order or some sort of maybe a kind of anti-black hate crime bill or something, because actually, you know, Joe Biden was one of the authors, one of the people that pushed through the 94 crime bill, which caused irreparable damage to the black community. Many people are still locked up as a result of it from crimes that they never should have been locked up for. It's been widely acknowledged that the 94 crime bill was a mistake, I think by Biden, I think by the Clintons. And actually, you know, Biden was one of the people that used the language that came dangerously close to the super predator language that the Clintons were using. And so Joe Biden needs to do a lot more than just offer words. He needs to take concrete action to ensure that the system of injustice is replaced by a system of justice.
Right, okay. So what about his other colleagues, Derek Chauvin's colleagues? Are they going to suffer a similar fate now that Derek himself has been found guilty?
Well, I mean, if I were their lawyers, I mean, I would call the prosecution state the next morning and try to plea bargain, because, I mean, usually they've lost a lot of leverage by getting one conviction on the Chauvin case. It's more likely that they would also be found guilty as well, because similar set of facts. They were aiding and abetting. They were onlookers that could have done something, and they didn't do anything to actually change the situation. So my own view is that, I mean, if they can find the right jury that's not been tainted by this conviction, I mean, that would be another difficulty. But if they can do that, I believe that they would do a plea bargain for lighter sentences.
So, David, there was an Officer Quang who was part of the officers who came to the scene. He'd only been part of the force for only a couple of days. Is he equally as culpable as the rest of the officers on the scene that day?
I believe so. Any officer who arrived at that scene and observed what was happening to George Floyd is culpable. And let's also bear in mind that police officers have a higher duty than does an ordinary citizen when it comes to stopping something like a state murder, a state sanctioned murder, which essentially this was. So all of those officers who just sort of observed George Floyd for 9 minutes lose consciousness and die in front of their eyes and refuse to do anything are culpable and should be held accountable to the varying degrees under the law. And I believe they will. Now, are they going to be convicted to the degree that Derek Chauvin was? No, but there has to be accountability. And yes, they are culpable.
Right, okay. So, Richard, one of the many theories that a lot of people are now talking in terms of the policing system is that should the police now pay for misconduct of the victims? So if you move the funding, rather than taxpayers pay for the families and the victims who've suffered in the hands of police, if you move it over to the police, if the police have to pay it, then they'll probably have to kind of know, how to act and maybe put a bit of insurance on the police force. What is your take on that? Is that a right way or is that another way?
I think that might be one of the stepping stones. I think ultimately if the problem is quite obviously diagnosed, in many ways the solutions are simple. Police need to be jailed, they need to be jailed quickly, they need to get serious jail terms for carrying out such offences. That message needs to be sent by the justice system. They need to lose their pensions and they need to be seen to be held to account by the laws they're supposed to uphold. I think it's that simple.
Right, okay. So David, what other ways can the police, can we reform this whole police in America? What sort of suggestions do you have in terms of reforming the police?
I think we need to reimagine the standards and the requirements we have for police officers to actually become police officers. In many states, you can become a police officer in 6 weeks, very little training. Not to mention there's no really profiling of officers or investigating to ensure that they are not operating under any racist pretense when they become police officers. It's a very low bar, a very low standard to entry to become a police officer. And we need to, I think, raise the stakes in terms of how we value that profession so that we're getting better people who are who have ethical fortitude and have a real commitment to the communities they police. I mean, let's just imagine in this case, imagine if there was a police officer who came on the scene and witnessed Derek Chauvin attacking and murdering George Floyd and actually did something about it, actually stepped in to intervene, took Derek Chauvin off of him, maybe even put him in handcuffs and said, I just witnessed you assaulting one of our citizens we're sworn to protect. Those are the kind of people we need enlisting in the police force. So we can talk about defunding the police, but we need to talk about restructuring the entire culture so that the people who become police officers have an affinity for the communities they police. And until we have that, I think we're going to have the same result.
Right. Rotimi, do you think the sentences, when it comes to sentences, will be justifiable in the end?
Well, I mean, the what they call the sentencing scale says between 12 and a half years or 40 years for the second degree murder. And I think, I mean, why they are talking about aggravating circumstances, the kids there, you had higher duty because he was a police officer. I think he would argue, I mean, if there wasn't aggravating circumstances, he would get 12 and a half years because he's a police officer. He committed the act while he was a police officer. But now, I'm hoping that we'll get at least 20 years of the 40-year scale. And you'll be the upper end of the scale as opposed to be the lower end of the scale. The maximum he would spend, he would come out at some point in time if he survives it. But I'm hoping that he would get at least minimum 20 years because of the aggravating circumstances.
Right, okay. So Richard, honestly speaking, did you actually think he was ever going to get convicted whilst you're watching the trial?
I think as time went on, that was the sense you kind of got, because I think what was smart was the primary piece of evidence was the video of George Floyd being killed. That video was played again and again. And so I think we can't really overstate the importance actually of citizens being able to film the police. Of course, it's a high-profile case, but yeah, certainly. I mean, it was a pretty damning case, really, against Chauvin. I think, as time went on, it was clear he was going to be found guilty. Sentencing is still, I think, about 8 weeks or so away. So let's see the sentence he gets. I think, from the point of view of George Floyd's family, I think unless he spends the rest of his natural life, or certainly the part of that which really counts behind bars, I don't think we could really call that a serious stepping stone towards justice.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you, Rotimi. Well, that's all we have time for on this edition of Your Voice. I'd like to thank my studio guests, Richard Sudan, Rotimi Pedro, and David Matthew. And thank you for watching. We'll be back next week, same time, same place, only on Yanga TV. Looking forward to seeing you there. Until then, good night.
It seems extraordinary that there's nothing that the coronavirus doesn't touch.
All seen Black Lives Matter demonstrations.
Oppression is brought out.
So unfortunately, because I just feel like we're going down this road, we've been down this road before.